J.W. Williams Funeral Directors have been proudly serving the people of this community since 1918. Service is our motto. The poor, the rich, the middle class, and all are given the best of care and attention at all times. You have the privilege to select what you want. In your time of need, contact the capable, the competent, and the dependable staff of the J.W. Williams Funeral Home who is genuinely concerned with your care. At J.W. Williams Funeral Home, you are aptly served by the proprietor, president, Deacon Arthur L. Parker, who continues the traditions and values set forth by the past president, Dr. Napoleon Williams. Your announcers for the J.W. Williams Funeral Home Sunday morning program are Deacon Arthur L. Parker, Reverend Isaac H. Owens, Mrs. Calandra Wilkerson Parker, Minister Frankie Harmon, Miss Sandra Johnson, and Deacon Earl Clark, Jr.
Thank you, and good morning, friends. We come to you this morning to bring announcements, dedications, and songs. We certainly hope that your day may be brighter after listening to our program. The family of Mr. Daniel Cornelius Sharper Woods of Americus, Georgia. The family of Mr. Willie James Dawson of Cordele, Georgia. The family of United States Marine Corps veteran Mr. Eddie Eugene Hughes Jr. of Cordele, Georgia. The family of Mrs. Maida Johnson Smith of Cordele, Georgia. The family of Miss Jacqueline Howard of Cordele, Georgia, would like to thank their many friends for the food, the flowers, the condolences, and all other expressions of sympathy and kindness shown to them during their hours of sorrow and bereavement during the past week. Mr. Daniel Cornelius Sharper Woods, age 31, of 129 South Dudley Street, Americus, Georgia, died Thursday, January 26, at the St. Francis Hospital in Columbus, Georgia. The funeral service for Mr. Daniel Cornelius Sharper Woods, age 36, was held Sunday, February 5th, graveside at the Eastview Cemetery in Americus, Georgia. His beloved sister, Elder Sabrina Sharper Graham, officiated. Survivors include his beloved daughter, Miss Kayla D. Woods of DeSoto, Georgia, his loving mother, Miss Ruthie Gray Sharper, his loving parents, Mrs. Bobby Woods and Mr. Robert McCoy, his beloved godmother, Miss Teresa A. Cooks, his beloved and loving sisters, Elder Sabrina Sharper Graham and her husband, Mr. Laturia Graham of Locust Grove, Georgia, Miss Erica Sharper of Thomasville, Georgia, Miss Lucille Sharper of Albany, Georgia, and Miss Aretha Woods of Americus, Georgia. A beloved brother, Mr. Henry Woods of Americus, Georgia, a host of other relatives, and many, many sorrowing friends, to include his special friend, Mr. Caleb McDonald of DeSoto, Georgia, survived Mr. Daniel Cornelius Sharper, age 31, of 129 South Dudley Street, Americus, Georgia. Mr. Willie James Dawson Jr., age 66, of 2002 South 7th Street, Cordele, Georgia, died Friday, January 27th, at the Grady Memorial Hospital in Atlanta, Georgia. The funeral service for Mr. Willie James Dawson Jr., age 66, was held Sunday, February 5th, graveside at the Vienna City Cemetery in Vienna, Georgia. Pastor Dwayne Collier officiated. Survivors include his loving and devoted wife, Mrs. Gwendolyn Walker Dawson of Cordele, Georgia, his loving and caring children, Mr. Antonio D. Dawson and Miss Olivia V. Dawson, both of Cordele, Georgia. 12 beloved grandchildren, 4 great-grandchildren, his loving and caring sisters, Mrs. Annie Lee Thomas of Hackensack, New Jersey, Miss Jenny Lee Hampton of Covington, Georgia, and Miss Norma Jean Hicks of Cordele, Georgia. His beloved brothers, Mr. Dave Hutchinson of Dooley County, Georgia, Mr. Roy Lee Dawson and Mr. Ricky Dawson Sr., and Mr. Joe Dennis Dawson, all of Cordele, Georgia. A host of beloved nieces and nephews, cousins, other relatives, and many, many sorrowing friends survive. Mr. Willie James Dawson Jr., age 66, of 2002 South 7th Street, Cordele, Georgia. United States Marine Corps veteran, Mr. Eddie Eugene Hughes Jr., age 75, of 702 West 17th Avenue, Cordele, Georgia, died Wednesday, February 1st, at the Chris Regional Nursing and Rehabilitation Center in Cordele, Georgia. The funeral service for United States Marine Corps veteran, Mr. Eddie Eugene Hughes Jr., age 75, was held Saturday, February 11th, in the sanctuary of the Shady Grove Baptist Church in Cordele, Georgia. The Reverend Kelvin Drake, pastor, the Reverend Charles Guyton officiated. The burial with full military honors followed at the Bethel Cemetery in Cordele, Georgia. Survivors include a loving and devoted friend, Miss Minnie Redding of Cordele, Georgia, his beloved godchildren, Mr. Ricky Redding and his wife, Miss Angela Redding of Atlanta, Georgia, Mr. Frederick Smith and his wife, Mrs. Michelle Smith of Cordele, Georgia, and Mr. Xavier Smith and his wife, Mrs. Samantha Smith of Atlanta, Georgia. His beloved brother, Mr. Mark Hughes, and his wife, Mrs. Deborah Hughes of Cordele, Georgia. A beloved stepsister, Minister Dicey Relaford, a stepbrother, the Reverend Calvin Dyers. A host of loving friends to include the class of 1965 survived United States Marine Corps veteran, Mr. Eddie Eugene Hughes Jr., age 75, of 702 West 17th Avenue, Cordele, Georgia. Mrs. Maydie Johnson Smith, age 76, of 306 West 19th Avenue, Cordele, Georgia, died Sunday, February 5th, at her residence in Cordele, Georgia. The funeral service for Mrs. Maydie Johnson Smith, age 76, was held Saturday, February 11th, at the J.W. Williams Funeral Home Chapel in Cordele, Georgia. Her pastor, Pastor Jimmy Felton, pastor of the New Way Pentecostal Church, officiated. The burial followed at the Bethel Cemetery in Cordele, Georgia. Survivors include her loving and devoted husband, Mr. Roosevelt Smith of Cordele, Georgia, her loving and devoted children, Mrs. Michelle Porter and her husband, Mr. Melvin Porter, and Miss Marilyn Smith and her husband, Mr. Charlie Smith, all of Cordele, Georgia. Mr. Roosevelt D. Smith and his wife, Mrs. Melissa Smith, and Mr. Carvian Smith of Clearwaters, Florida, Mr. Rontavious Daniel and his wife, Mrs. Sonia Daniels of Cordele, Georgia. 7 beloved grandchildren, 6 beloved great-grandchildren, her loving sisters, Mrs. Emma Hill of Macon, Georgia, Mrs. Ella Mae Porter of Warner Robins, Georgia, Mrs. Annie Roundtree of Belglades, Florida, Mrs. Mary Sanders of Clearwaters, Florida, and Miss Bernice Hestel and her husband, Mr. Harvey Hestel of Cordele, Georgia. Her beloved brother, Mr. Willie James Johnson of Cordele, Georgia. Her sisters-in-law, Mrs. Alice Hill, and her husband, Mr. Sammy Hill of Cordele, Georgia. Mr. Ozzie Smith and his wife, Mrs. Mardell Smith of Miami, Florida. Mrs. Ruby Coleman and Miss Catherine Reese, both of Cordele, Georgia. And Mrs. Barbara Milligan and her husband, Mr. Edwin Milligan of Ocala, Florida. Her brothers-in-law, Mr. Sammy Parker and his wife, Mrs. April Parker of Atlanta, Georgia. Mr. Willie James Parker and his wife, Mrs. Flora Parker of Local Grove, Georgia. A host of beloved nieces and nephews, cousins, other relatives, and many, many sorrowing friends, to include Mrs. Carol Johnson of Cordele, Georgia, and Mrs. Otha Everett of Macon, Georgia. Survived Mrs. Mady Johnson Smith, age 76, of 306 West 19th Avenue, Cordele, Georgia. Miss Jacqueline Power, age 58, of 2124 South Highway 41, Cordele, Georgia, died Thursday, January 26, at her residence in Cordele, Georgia. Survivors include her loving and devoted husband, Mr. Robert C. Dennis of Cordele, Georgia, her loving and devoted children, Miss Shamika Power and Miss Rebecca Power, both of Florida, Mr. Robert Dennis of Georgia, 4 grandchildren, her beloved sisters, Miss Donna Power, Miss Sandra White, and Miss Teresa Bethette, all of South Carolina. Her beloved brothers, Mr. Julius Power and Mr. Donnell Power, both of Cordele, Georgia, Mr. Ernest Power of New Jersey, her grandparents, Mr. Harold and Miss Jacqueline Power of South Carolina, a host of beloved nieces, nephews, aunts, and uncles, many cousins, other relatives, and many, many sorrowing friends survive. Miss Jacqueline Power, age 58, of 2124 South Highway 41, Cordele, Georgia. Again, the family of Mr. Daniel Cornelius Sharper Woods of Americus, Georgia. The family of Mr. Willie James Dawson of Cordele, Georgia. The family of United States Marine Corps veteran Mr. Eddie Eugene Hughes Jr. of Cordele, Georgia. The family of Mrs. Mady Johnson Smith of Cordele, Georgia. The family of Miss Jacqueline Power of Cordele, Georgia would like to thank their many friends for all of the many kindnesses shown to them during their hours of sorrow and bereavement during the past week. May God bless each of you is their prayer. The J.W. Williams Funeral Directors serving Cordele and Vienna were in charge of each of these arrangements during the past week. It is certainly with the deepest regret that we make the following announcements. Mr. Monte K. Reed Jr., age 26, of 2124 Doris Street, Cordele, Georgia, died Monday, February 6 at the Chris Regional Hospital in Cordele, Georgia. Survivors include his loving and devoted mother, Miss Daquita Peterson, and our husband, Mr. Willie Peterson of Cordele, Georgia, his beloved and caring father, Mr. Monte K. Reed Sr., and his wife, Miss Kendra Reed of Cordele, Georgia, his beloved sisters, Miss Shanteria Dean and her husband, Mr. Dan Dean, Miss Montasia Reed, both of Cordele, Georgia, his beloved brother, Mr. DeQuan Thomas of Warner Robins, Georgia, Mr. Devon Smothers of Cordele, Georgia, his loving and caring grandparents, Mrs. Annie Peterson, Miss Cassandra Reed, and Mr. Leon Walker, all of Cordele, Georgia, a beloved great-grandmother, Miss Pearl Reed of Cordele, Georgia, his beloved aunts and uncles, Miss Shavetta Barner and her husband, Mr. Jerry Barner, Miss Rebecca Walker, and Mr. Marlon Reed, all of Cordele, Georgia, Mrs. Jennifer Anderson and her husband, Mr. Troy Anderson of Tampa, Florida, Mr. Greg Peterson and his wife, Mrs. Tracy Peterson of Vienna, Georgia, Mr. Derek Peterson and his wife, Mrs. Musselin Peterson of Goose Creek, South Carolina, his beloved great aunts and great uncles, Miss Maydie Clark, Miss Zelda McGriff and her husband, Mr. Butch McGriff, Miss Marjorie Kears and her husband, Mr. Roger Kears, all of Cordele, Georgia, and Miss Debbie Reed of Atlanta, Georgia, his beloved nieces and nephews, a host of cousins, a special friend, Miss Kadasia Johnson of Cordele, Georgia, a host of other relatives, and many, many sorrowing friends survive Mr. Monte K. Reed Jr., age 26, of 2124 Doris Street, Cordele, Georgia. The funeral service for Mr. Monte K. Reed Jr., age 26, will be held today, Sunday, February 12, at 2 p.m. in the sanctuary of the Shady Grove Baptist Church in Cordele, Georgia. The pastor, Reverend Kelvin Drake, will officiate. The burial will follow at the Bethel Cemetery in Cordele, Georgia. Deacon Johnny Lee Little, age 85, of 197 Old Dawson Road, Cordele, Americus, Georgia, died Thursday, February 9th at the Phoebe Sumter Medical Center in Americus, Georgia. Survivors include his loving and devoted wife, Mrs. Ruby May Hicks Little of Americus, Georgia, his loving and devoted children, Mr. Johnny Little and his wife, Mrs. Bobby Little of Americus, Georgia, Mr. Melvin Little and his wife, Mrs. Gail Little of Valdosta, Georgia, Mr. Curtis Little of Americus, Georgia, and Mrs. Renee Little Waters and her husband, Mr. Jeff Waters of St. John's, Florida. 11 loving grandchildren, 23 great-grandchildren, his beloved sisters, Mrs. Mary Rouse, Mrs. Earlene Brown, Mrs. Elaine Baker and her husband, Alfonso Baker, and Mrs. Gloria Jones and her husband, Mr. James Jones, all of Americus, Georgia, Mrs. Anna Broner and her husband, Mr. Lester Broner of Kennesaw, Georgia, and Miss Mrs. Connie Kinchins and her husband, Mr. Reefus Kinchins of Stockbridge, Georgia. A beloved brother, Mr. James Little Sr. of Americus, Georgia. A host of devoted nieces, nephews, cousins, other relatives, and many, many sorrowing friends survive. Deacon Johnny Lee Little, age 85, of 197 Old Dawson Road, Americus, Georgia. The funeral service for Deacon Johnny Lee Little, age 85, will be held Tuesday, February 14th at 11 a.m. in the sanctuary of the Lebanon Baptist Church in Plains, Georgia. The Reverend Christopher O'Brien, pastor, his pastor, the Reverend O. Quintard Bryant, pastor of the Bethlehem Baptist Church of Plains, Georgia, will officiate. The burial will follow at the Staley Memorial Garden in Americus, Georgia. The public visitation will be Monday, February 13th from 1 until 5 p.m. at the J.W. Williams Funeral Home. United States Army veteran, Mr. Jerry Omar Brown, age 35, of 1305 West Waldale Avenue, Albany, Georgia, died Sunday, February 5th at the Phoebe Putney Memorial Hospital in Albany, Georgia. Survivors include his beloved wife, Mrs. Brittany Brown of Albany, Georgia, 4 living children, Mr. Trinity Brown, Ms. Jenny Brown, Miss Alasia Brown of all of Albany, Georgia, and Mr. Jerry Omar Brown Jr. of Alabama. A bonus son, Tristan Graham of Douglasville, Georgia. His beloved and devoted mother, Miss Rhonda Brown of Albany, Georgia. His beloved father, Mr. Jerry Britley of Albany, Georgia. His God-sent father, Mr. George Evans Jr., and his wife, Mrs. Tina Evans, all of Albany, Georgia. His beloved grandmother, Mrs. Bernice Johnson Brown of Albany, Georgia. 3 beloved brothers, Mr. Benlis Evans Sr. of Albany, Georgia, Mr. Jeremiah Jones, and Mr. Jeremy Jones, all of Sylvester, Georgia. 3 bonus brothers, Mr. Dontavius Polite, Mr. Cordelius Evans, and Mr. James Stevens, all of Albany, Georgia. 7 beloved aunts, Miss Rotunda Brown, Miss Ruby Britley, Miss Odessa Britley, Miss Beauty Britley, and Miss Carol Britley, all of Albany, Georgia. Miss Minnie Britley of San Antonio, Texas. Miss Ethel Anthony and her husband, Mr. Charlie Anthony of Fort Walton, Florida. 4 God-sent aunts, Mrs. Raynetta Dukes of Atlanta, Georgia. Miss Cheyenne Scott of Douglasville, Georgia, Miss Devetta Johnson of Smithville, Georgia, Miss Angela Legriff of Albany, Georgia. 6 beloved uncles, Mr. Roosevelt Britley and his wife, Mrs. Mattie Britley, Mr. Willie Britley, Mr. Terry Britley, Mr. Michael Britley and his wife, Mrs. Record Britley, Mr. Mark Britley and his wife, Mrs. Latasha Britley, all of Albany, Georgia, and Mr. Bobby Britley of Leesburg, Georgia. His beloved nieces and nephews, 7 great aunts, 2 great uncles, a host of devoted cousins, other relatives, and many, many sorrowing friends survive. United States Army veteran, Mr. Jerry Omar Brown, age 35, of 1305 West Waldale Avenue, Albany, Georgia. The funeral service for United States Army veteran Mr. Jerry Omar Brown, age 35, will be held Saturday, February 18, 2023 at 10 a.m. at the Monroe Comprehensive High School Auditorium in Albany, Georgia. The burial with military honors will be Tuesday, February 21st at 10 a.m. at the Rotunda at the Andersonville National Cemetery in Andersonville, Georgia. The public visitation will be Friday, February 17 from 1 until 5 p.m. at the J.W. Williams Funeral Home. M. Paul, age 52, of 317 Fish Hatchery Road, Cordele, Georgia, died Sunday, February 5th at the South Georgia Medical Center in Valdosta, Georgia. Survivors include her loving and devoted husband, Mr. Gary Sistrunk of Cordele, Georgia, her loving and caring children, Mr. Gary Sistrunk Jr., Ms. Jaquara Sistrunk, Mr. Gary Brown, all of West Palm Beach, Florida. Her loving sibling, Mr. Tracy Paul and his companion, Miss Yvonne Kennedy, Mr. Rodney Paul, all of Cordele, Georgia, Mr. Corey Paul and his wife, Mrs. Melissa Paul of South Carolina, the Reverend Keith Lewis and his wife, Mrs. Larissa Lewis of Vienna, Georgia, Miss Sheila Sweeney of Perry, Georgia, Miss Kimberly Street Brinson of Cordele, Georgia, Mr. Lafayette Street and his wife, Mrs. Sherelle Street of Nashville, Tennessee, Miss Nikita Brown of Beale Air Force Base, California, Miss Michonne Brown of Cordele, Georgia, Mr. James Graham of Statesboro, Georgia, the children she helped rear, Miss Kadisha Paul, Miss Asia Lofton, both of Warner Robins, Georgia, Mr. Tristan Paul, Mr. Courtney Johnson, Mr. Sam Sneed, all of Cordele, Georgia, her beloved aunts and uncles, Miss Dorothy Paul and Miss Mary Arner, and her husband, Mr. Governor Arner, both of Cordele, Georgia, Miss Martha Williams of Warner Robins, Georgia, Miss Rose Mary Street Brock, and her husband, Mr. James Brock of Atlanta, Georgia, and Mr. Freddie Paul of Drayton, Georgia. A host of beloved nieces and nephews, to include Miss LaQuana Paul and Miss Antoinette Johnson. A host of devoted cousins, other relatives, and many, many sorrowing friends survive. Miss Trina M. Paul, age 52, of 317 Fish Hatchery Road, Cordele, Georgia. The funeral service for Miss Trina M. Paul, age 52, will be held Sunday, February 19th at 11 a.m. graveside at the Macedonia Baptist Church Cemetery, Drayton Community, Vienna, Georgia. Her beloved brother, the Reverend Keith Lewis, will officiate. The public visitation will be Saturday, February 18th from 1 until 5 p.m. at the J.W. Williams Funeral Home. Mr. Calvin B. Johnson Sr., better known as Peanut, age 40, of 1202 East Blue Lane, Cordele, Georgia, died Thursday, January 26, at the Chris Regional Nursing and Rehabilitation Center in Cordele, Georgia. Survivors include his loving and devoted children, Miss Shanteria Holmes of Cordele, Georgia, Mr. Calvin B. Johnson Jr. and Mr. Caleb Johnson, both of Albany, Georgia. His beloved father, Mr. Samuel McKenzie of Cordele, Georgia. A beloved brother, Mr. Alvin B. Johnson Sr., and his wife, Mrs. Crystal Johnson of Columbus, Georgia. A loving and devoted aunt, Mrs. Mary Lango Smith of Cordele, Georgia. A devoted cousin, Deacon Terry Lango, and his wife, Mrs. Wanjika Lango of Cordele, Georgia. A host of beloved cousins, other relatives, and many sorrowing friends survive. Mr. Calvin B. Johnson Sr., better known as Peanut, age 40, of 1206 East Blue Lane, Cordele, Georgia. The funeral service for Mr. Calvin B. Johnson, better known as Peanut, age 40, will be announced at a later date, pending the completion of the arrangements. Miss Elizabeth Adams, age 40, of 546 Marion Way, Warner Robins, Georgia, died Wednesday, February 8th at the Darmody Medical Center in Fitzgerald, Georgia. Survivors include her loving and beloved daughter, Miss Isabella Adams, her beloved mother, Mrs. Mary Freeman Adams, her beloved father, Mr. John C. Adams II, her loving sibling, Miss Barbara Hardy, Miss Mary Adams, and Mr. Tony Adams, her beloved nieces and nephews, Mr. Jonathan Adams, Mr. William Moore, Mrs. Masheta Moore, Miss Malaya Moore, Mr. Quentin Moore, Mr. Alexander Adams, Miss Victoria Adams, Mr. Shanteria Hardy, Miss Shaquilla Hardy, and Miss Shanice Adams. A host of beloved cousins, other relatives, and many sorrowing friends survive. Miss Elizabeth Adams, age 40, of 546 Marion Way, Warner Robins, Georgia. The funeral service for Miss Elizabeth Adams, age 40, will be announced at a later date, pending the completion of the arrangements. Mr. Samuel James Maynor, age 62, of 1116 McClendon Court, Cordele, Georgia, died Thursday, February 9th at the Chris Regional Hospital in Cordele, Georgia. Survivors include his loving and devoted mother, Mother May Frances Maynor of Warner Robins, Georgia. His loving and devoted children, Miss Keisha Gaston and her husband, Mr. Dennis Gaston, Mrs. Roshonda McKeever and her husband, Mr. Reginald McKeever, both of Cordele, Georgia, and Mr. Samuel K. Maynor of Atlanta, Georgia. 9 beloved grandchildren, 1 great-grandchild, his loving and caring sibling, the Reverend Nelson Maynor, and his wife, Mrs. Melinda Maynor, Miss Marilyn Williams, all of Cordele, Georgia, Mr. Benny Maynor, and his wife, Mrs. Brenda Maynor of Byram, Georgia, Mrs. Eddie Jean Brown and her husband, Mr. Johnny Brown of Cordele, Georgia, Mr. Ernest Maynor and his wife, Mrs. Lorraine Maynor of Albany, Georgia, and Miss Sarah Ann White of Warner Robins, Georgia. His cousin, who were regarded as brothers, Mr. Herman J. Jackson of Cordele, Georgia, Mr. Ralph Harold of Orlando, Florida, a beloved uncle, Mr. Freddie Pittman of Cordele, Georgia, a host of beloved nieces and nephews, many cousins, other relatives, and many sorrowing friends survive. Mr. Samuel James Maynor, age 62, of 1116 McClendon Court, Cordele, Georgia. The funeral service for Mr. Samuel James Maynard, age 62, will be announced at a later date, pending the completion of the arrangements. Mother Ledotis Bryant Butts, age 89, of 225 Main Street, Leesburg, Georgia, died Saturday, February 11th at her residence in Leesburg, Georgia. Survivors include her loving and devoted children, Mr. Albert Butts Jr. of Orlando, Florida, Mr. Ernest Butts and his wife, Mrs. Willie Mae Butts of Leesburg, Georgia, Mr. Charles Butts and Mrs. Irene B. Williams, both of Albany, Georgia, Mr. James Butts and his wife, Mrs. Melinda Butts, and her husband, Mr. Yarn Hardy of Decatur, Georgia. 16 beloved grandchildren, 15 great-grandchildren, her beloved sisters, Miss Bertha Cummings and Miss Virginia Power, Miss Dorothy Cobb, all of Americus, Georgia, and Miss Sarah Cobb of Chicago, Illinois, her beloved brothers, Mr. Johnny Power and Mr. Tommy Power, both of Daytona Beach, Florida, the Reverend Arthur Cobb and his wife, Mrs. Ernestine Cobb of Ocala, Florida, a host of beloved nieces and nephews, many cousins, other relatives, and many sorrowing friends survive. Mother Ledotis Bryant Butts, age 89, of 225 Main Street, Leesburg, Georgia. The funeral service for Mother Ledotis Bryant Butts, age 89, will be announced at a later date, pending the completion of the arrangements. The J.W. Williams Funeral Directors, serving Cordele and Vienna, are in charge of each of these arrangements during this week. Friends, that conclude our funeral notices for this morning, and as always, we do remind you concerning our pre-funeral arrangements planning available at the J.W. Williams Funeral Home, with packages available with a single pay, a 3-year pay, a 5-year pay, and a 10-year pay. So please stop by and talk with us concerning your pre-funeral arrangements needs available at the J.W. Williams Funeral Home. And also whole life insurance is available at the J.W. Williams Funeral Home. And now for announcement. The Friendship Baptist Church of Findlay, Georgia, annual Family and Friends Day will be today, Sunday, February 12th at 11 a.m. Everyone is invited to attend. Sister Inez H. Johnson, Secretary, the Reverend Joseph Atkins, Pastor. The Holly Grove Baptist Church annual Family and Friends Day will be today, Sunday, February 12th at 11 a.m. Everyone is invited to attend. Deacon Robert Woodson Jr., Chairman of Deacons, the Reverend W.G. Grover, Pastor. The new Poplar Springs Baptist Church of Byronville, Georgia, Black History Program will be Sunday, February 26th at 9:45 a.m. Mrs. Patricia Williams of Cordele, Georgia, will be the guest speaker. Everyone is invited to attend. The Reverend Johnny Dean, Pastor, New Poplar Springs Baptist Church of Byronville, Georgia. The Mount Zion First African Baptist Church, Cordele, Georgia, conference call scheduled Sunday morning at 10 a.m. Prayer Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at 12 noon. Bible study each Wednesday at 5 p.m. The call-in number 339-209-6419, 339-209-6419. Everyone is invited. Deacon Joe Wedges, Chairman of Deacons, the Reverend Dan James III, Pastor. The Gethsemane Baptist Church invites everyone to worship with them 10:30 a.m. Mother Mary Butler, Church Mother, Deacon Johnny Wilson, Chairman of Deacons, Reverend Cecil Straughter, Pastor. The Davis Chapel CME Church of Arabi, Georgia, invites everyone to worship with them today, Sunday at 10 a.m. Face mask required. Brother Ruby Barrett, Chairman of Stewards, and the Reverend Arnell Webern, Pastor. The Spring Hill Baptist Church invites everyone to worship with them today, Sunday at 10 a.m. Mother Lily Mathis, Church Mother, the Reverend Shannon Select, Pastor. The New Oak Grove Baptist Church invites everyone to worship with them each Sunday. Sunday school at 9:15 a.m., worship service at 10 a.m. Face covering is required. Sister Letha Askew, church clerk and trustee, Deacon Alonzo Jones, Chairman of Deacons, and the Reverend W. Wilson, Pastor. The Beautiful Zion Baptist Church invites everyone to worship with them today at 11 a.m. Mother Grace Patrick, Church Mother, the Reverend Lorinda Ray, Pastor. The Mount Calvary Baptist Church invites everyone to worship with them today. Sunday school at 9:45 a.m., worship service at 10:30 a.m. Mother Evelyn Lewis, Church Mother, the Reverend Leon Spears, Chairman of Deacons, the Reverend Isaac H. Owens, Pastor. The New Corinth Baptist Church, Leslie, Georgia, invites everyone to worship with them each third Sunday at 10 a.m. The Reverend Carl Smith, Pastor. The Jerusalem Baptist Church of Ellaville, Georgia, will celebrate the first pastoral anniversary of Dr. Deanne and the Reverend Johnny Hosley, Sunday, February 12th, today at 11 a.m. Apostle Patrick Hosley of Salvation and Praise Ministry of Albany, Georgia, will be the guest minister. Everyone is invited. Dr. Deanne Hosley, Pastor, the Jerusalem Baptist Church, 1619 Shallow Road, Ellaville, Georgia. The McAfee Grove Baptist Church of Leesburg, Georgia, invites everyone to worship with them. Family nights Tuesday at 7 p.m., small class studies Thursday at 7 p.m., Sunday morning worship at 9 a.m. Everyone is invited. Dr. Robert C. Morgan, Sr., Pastor. Mrs. Fanny Pittman and Miss Pinky Power Addy is asking for donation to help with the annual cleaning costs of Hardshell Cemetery. For more information, please call Mrs. Fanny Pittman at 229-405-4358 or Miss Pinky Powell's Addy at 817-489-8126. Kitty's Corner Daycare, 112 12th Avenue West, Cordele, Georgia. King and Queen will be Friday, February 24th at 6 p.m. For more information, please call Miss Freddie Lewis at 229-699-2324. Brother Norris Mathis' 16th Gospel Anniversary will be Sunday, February 26, 2023 at A.S. Clark Medical Institute, 401 North 15th Street, Cordele, Georgia. On program will be the Gospel Travelers of Oakfield, Georgia, the Gospel Pioneers of Vienna, Georgia, the Gospel Stars of Lilly, Georgia, Blessed and Highly Favored, Warner Robins, Georgia, New Silver Stars of Macon, Georgia, Bubba and the Zionaires. The doors open at 3 p.m. The program will start at 4 p.m. Everyone in attendance is required to wear a mask. Brother Norris Mathis, 16th Gospel Anniversary. Mrs. Linda Faye Marlin will be feeding the homeless every fourth Sunday in each month from 2 until 4 p.m. For delivery and for more information, please call 229-401-8868. Wilcox County Head Start, Rochelle, Georgia, is offering free child care development service for eligible families with children aged 3 to 5. For more information, please contact Ms. Donna Jenkins at 229-365-2341. You're invited to worship with the Greater Morris Tabernacle Baptist Church today with Sunday school at 9 a.m., morning worship at 9:30 a.m. The annual Deacon and Deaconess anniversary will be observed. Deacon Norman Dexter will be the guest speaker. Everyone is invited to attend. Deaconess Cassandra Jackson, Deaconess President, Deacon Tommy Ford, Vice Chairman of Deacons, Dr. K.M. Williams is the pastor. It is certainly with the deepest regret that we make the following announcement. Mr. Monte K. Reed Jr., age 26, of 2124 Doris Street, Cordele, Georgia, died Monday, February 6, at the Chris Regional Hospital in Cordele, Georgia. The funeral service for Mr. Monte K. Reed Jr., age 26, will be held today, Sunday, February 12, at 2 p.m. in the sanctuary of the Shady Grove Baptist Church in Cordele, Georgia. The pastor, Reverend Kelvin Drake, will officiate. The burial will follow at the Bethel Cemetery in Cordele, Georgia. Deacon Johnny Lee Little, age 85, of 197 Old Dawson Road, Americus, Georgia, died Thursday, February 9th at the Phoebe Sumter Medical Center in Americus, Georgia. The funeral service for Deacon Johnny Lee Little, age 85, will be held Tuesday, February 14th at 11 a.m. in the sanctuary of the Lebanon Baptist Church in Plains, Georgia. The Reverend Christopher O'Brien, pastor, his pastor, the Reverend O. Quintard Bryant, pastor of the Bethlehem Baptist Church in Plains, Georgia, will officiate. The burial will follow at Staley Memorial Gardens in Americus, Georgia. The public visitation will be Monday, February 13th from 1 until 5 p.m. at the J.W. Williams Funeral Home. United States Army veteran Mr. Jerry O'Mark Brown, age 35, of 1305 West Waldale Avenue, Albany, Georgia, died Sunday, February 5th at the Phoebe Putney Memorial Hospital in Albany, Georgia. The funeral service for United States Army veteran Mr. Jerry O'Mark Brown will be held Saturday, February 18th, 2023 at 10 a.m. at the Monroe Comprehensive High School Auditorium in Albany, Georgia. The burial with military honors will be Tuesday, February 21st at 10 a.m. at the Rotunda at the Andersonville National Cemetery in Andersonville, Georgia. The public visitation will be Friday, February 17th from 1 until 5 p.m. at the J.W. Williams Funeral Home. Miss Trina M. Paul, age 52, of 317 Fish Hatchery Road, Cordele, Georgia, died Sunday, February 5th at the South Georgia Medical Center in Valdosta, Georgia. The funeral service for Miss Trina M. Paul, age 52, will be held Sunday, February 19th at 11 a.m. graveside at the Macedonia Baptist Church Cemetery, Drayton Community, Vienna, Georgia. Her beloved brother, the Reverend Keith Lewis, will officiate. The public visitation will be Saturday, February 18th from 1 until 5 p.m. at the J.W. Williams Funeral Home. Mr. Calvin B. Johnson Sr., better known as Peanut, age 40, of 1206 East Blue Lane, Cordele, Georgia, died Thursday, January 26th at the Chris Regional Nursing and Rehabilitation Center in Cordele, Georgia. The funeral service for Mr. Calvin B. Johnson, better known as Peanut, age 40, will be announced at a later date, pending the completion of the arrangement. Miss Elizabeth Adams, age 40, of 546 Marion Way, Warner Robins, Georgia, died Wednesday, February 8th at the Darmody Medical Center in Fitzgerald, Georgia. The funeral service for Miss Elizabeth Adams, age 40, will be announced at a later date, pending the completion of the arrangements. Mr. Samuel James Maynor, age 62, of 1116 McClendon Court, Cordele, Georgia, died Thursday, February 9th at the Chris Regional Hospital in Cordele, Georgia. The funeral service for Mr. Samuel James Maynor, age 62, will be announced at a later date, pending the completion of the arrangements. Mother Ledotis Bryant Butts, age 89, of 225 Main Street, Leesburg, Georgia, died Saturday, February 11th at her residence in Leesburg, Georgia. The funeral service for Mother Ledotis Bryant Butts, age 89, will be announced at a later date, pending the completion of the arrangements. The J.W. Williams Funeral Directors serving Cordele and Vienna are in charge of each of these arrangements during this week. Our program this morning is dedicated to the bereaved families whose loved ones were laid to rest during the past week. The family, Mr. Daniel Cornelius Sharper Woods of Americus, Georgia. The family, Mr. Willie James Dawson of Cordele, Georgia. The family of United States Marine Corps veteran, Mr. Eddie Eugene Hughes Jr. of Cordele, Georgia. The family, Mrs. Maydie Johnson Smith of Cordele, Georgia. The family, Ms. Jacqueline Power of Cordele, Georgia. Our program this morning is dedicated to the bereaved families whose loved ones will be laid to rest during this week. The family, Mr. Monte K. Reed Jr. of Cordele, Georgia. The family of Deacon Johnny Lee Little of Americus, Georgia. The family of United States Army veteran, Mr. Jerry Omar Brown of Albany, Georgia. The family of Miss Trina M. Paul of Cordele, Georgia. The family of Mr. Calvin B. Johnson of Cordele, Georgia. The family of Miss Elizabeth Adams of Warner Robins, Georgia. The family of Mr. Samuel James Maynor of Cordele, Georgia. The family of Mother Ledotis Bryant Butts of Leesburg, Georgia. Our program this morning is dedicated to all of the sick and shut-in, to all patients in the local and surrounding hospitals, nursing homes, and rehabilitation centers, to our beloved ministers and their devoted family members, to all retired educators, to the men and women serving in our armed forces, both stateside and abroad, to all veterans, and to everyone who listens to our program on each Sunday morning. It's a pleasure just to bring it to you. Our program goes out in memory of our past president, Dr. Napoleon Williams, to my wife, Mrs. Calandra Wilkerson Parker, to my son, Jai, Wilkerson Parker. This selection goes out to my mother-in-law, Mrs. Billy Ann Hall, and family, to my brother, retired Chief Master Sergeant Norman F. Dexter, who will be the guest speaker of the Deacon and Deaconess anniversary at the Greater Morris Tabernacle Baptist Church today. This goes out to my sister, Miss Maddie, Mrs. Patsy Jackson, and her husband, Jim Jackson of Cordele, Georgia. The selection goes out to my nephew, Deacon Kenneth Smith, program chairman of the Greater Morris Tabernacle Baptist Church. Now, Pastor Dr. K.M. Williams, pastor of the Greater Morris Tabernacle Baptist Church, and to all of the fellow deacons and deaconess of the Greater Morris Tabernacle Baptist Church. And again, to each and every one of you who listens to our program. And we do apologize for not being able to get around to our dedication, but I'm sure you understand due to the large number of announcements, but we'll bring those to you next week, be it the Lord's will. Our final selection for this morning.
joining us this morning. We hope you've enjoyed our program. Tune in again on next Sunday morning. In your time of need, contact the competent, capable, and dependable staff at the J.W. Williams Funeral Home.
Some of these days.